Greetings, fuckers, and welcome to our report on what we've been doing over in the private stream throughout the month of August. I've got a lot to tell you about, so let's jump into it before we start addressing the war of self compassion. So, lots of new shit to tell you about. First of all, there's video versions of every podcast now, and they're not just me and my whiteboard in a kind of dark RV where I'm recording from. They're now nice video presentations, slideshows, and graphics for you to check out. Also, the Back to Basics series is still streaming along. You can tune in with a free subscription on Patreon, where I've been putting out weekly episodes. That's at Traumatized Motherfuckers on Patreon to talk about more broad, general CPTSD information. Also, you can get those free episodes and the private stream episodes, most of them, anyways, at Complex PTSD Recovery on Spotify. We are Traumatized Motherfuckers. This way, you can watch the videos or listen right from your phone on Spotify if you have that subscription, but do not want to jump over to Patreon. It's there for you. And lastly, let me tell you that there's been a website revamp and a blogging activity taking place at t-mfrs.com. So it's a lot simpler now, and you also can get notified every time I post a new anything. Okay, jumping into August. It's been a busy month. Although I said 2024 would be my year of slowing down, it has not been. So we have wrapped on self-defenses for now, and we have moved right along into a number of other topics, such as the power, not shame, of fucking up, admitting mistakes, and apologizing. We've discussed asceticism, which is joyless self-deprivation as a method of self-protection. Big conversation there. We've jumped into an approach for treating chronic shame in those Back to Basics episodes, so you can get that one for free, as well as the episode on a user question. My partner has CPTSD. How do I make them seek treatment? I've got a controversial answer you might not love, or maybe you'll really appreciate it. And we discussed IDing and rewriting trauma thoughts, also in that free series. We discussed avoiding abuse, allowing stupidity, as I call it, because it forms the acronym ASS. And when we're being abusive, we are actually showing our trauma asses. So, got 2 posts on that for you. And finally, we leapt into a new series that we're about to discuss here: the necessity of self-compassion for healing, not only education and self-monitoring. So let's talk about that, huh? Compassion can be difficult to define, I find, but my favorite definition is finding similar ground between two separate beings. That's it. Not seeing someone as being such an outsider that you refuse to understand or empathize with them. And we need to be able to do the same thing with ourselves over time and space and trauma adventures. So, in trauma recovery, if we're doing it with a compassionate lens, it's largely about seeing the similarity between our child pains and experiences and our adult pains and experiences, how one leads into the next, and how we can feel for both of these beings. But the danger in CPTSD recovery, from what I've seen, is that over time, there's a initial increase in self-compassion that takes place where you realize, oh, these events from my early life matter, and that tiny child deserves some sympathy and care. And then eventually that self compassion kind of plummets as you continue on with your learnings and your journey, because you eventually decide, I'm going to kind of bypass these childhood pains and I will be the adult victor. At which point, our brain activities become very heavily monitored and policed. We also can fall into not really the trap, but the realization that our mental illness from our early experiences is not our fault, but it is our responsibility to manage it. And then the focus in our recovery can become this daily moderation and management of self rather than self understanding or compassion. But I've got to tell you that self accountability and forward motion cannot outweigh your recognition of self experience or your actions of self care, or else you aren't really healing your complex PTSD. You're kind of running from it and calling it healing while you watch yourself endlessly and try to behave the right ways. And meanwhile, you're not really tapping into the emotional wounds and experiences that need to be recognized and attended to as part of your recovery. So I'm here to propose that you cannot make long-term, enduring trauma recovery progress without self-compassion. Because 4 things. Number 1, post-traumatic growth requires that you challenge your old post-traumatic stresses. So that alone is going to require you to have some self-compassion in order to make the challenge or to be with yourself after the challenge takes place. Number 2, you will fuck up sometimes. It's just a part of learning and growing. Number 3, if you fear being stuck with yourself in this self-compassionless aftermath of fucking up when you try something new and challenge your PTSD, then you're never going to engage with step 1 and take the step of challenging any of your stresses. So number 4, in fact, you're likely to actually self-abuse, self-traumatize, and regress instead, which is a huge setback, not a point for recovery. And this is why this past month we had 2 episodes on the freedom of fucking up, the fact that admission of failure is not shameful. In fact, it's healing for you and the people around you. And the necessity for joyfully risk taking, fucking up, and healing trauma in order to actually make moves in your life and develop an existence that you want to live. These were based on a realization that I've had throughout the making of Traumatized Motherfuckers, which is that my fear of real outcomes after making a mistake and the actual material consequences of those outcomes after making a mistake, they are a tiny drop in a tiny bucket, or maybe even a Dixie cup, compared to my fear of living with my goddamn self after making a mistake, which is like a bottomless, endless ocean of terror. But the truth about making mistakes is that they only hurt because we make them hurt when we're lacking self compassion. I fucked up and I'm sorry is not any kind of admission of shame or self flagellation. It isn't a request for attention. It is not an indication of low self worth or brokenness. It also is not a sign of current suffering. In fact, I made a mistake is a positive thought because it's indicating that there's recognition of a cause and effect that took place in one's life and stepping up to say, I was in control of that. I did that. I made a mistake, and that's why this thing happened. That's a positive recognition to have because it gives you the power to do something different. It means you are in control of your own life. And I'm sorry is a positive relationship behavior. Apologizing is a good thing to do for you and for other people, not only because it helps to repair the relationship, but it also demonstrates to the people around you that you are the big enough man, woman, whatever you identify as, to acknowledge reality, to say, yeah, I made a little mistake there, and to go to your social comrade and acknowledge that it may have affected them. That's empowering to them in the relationship and in the rest of their relationships as they realize that they can do the same thing. So, fucking up and apologizing are not inherently shameful or demonstrative of esteem issues at all. But to us with CPTSD, relationally traumatized brains, unfortunately, these phrases have been conditioned as dangers, and we don't have very much self compassion when it comes to making mistakes. Unfortunately, to make trauma recovery progress, we have to do maybe the most difficult thing. We have to make self compassion progress so that change is possible without this looming threat and very real follow through of self punishment that most of us will apply to ourselves. So here's a nice little graphic that I've made. I do recommend checking it out if you are not watching the video. In order for post traumatic growth to happen, there have to be at least 5 steps. Number 1, this assessed or implicit fear of some kind of negative outcome, which has been programmed in us from prior traumas. Number 2, we feel that post traumatic stress. Our bodies are potentiated with nerves as we assume that negative things are going to happen to us. Number 3, we do a lot of critical thinking and challenge those beliefs and take action anyways. Number 4, we have to consciously compare our results versus our initial expectations in order to really sew it into our brains that our original trauma thoughts did not come to fruition. And number 5, this allows the recognition of new possibilities in life, which leads to growth, the absence of self limitation. But if we try to do this without self compassion and with memories of the ways that we have hounded ourselves in the past for making errors, it goes a lot differently. Check out this graphic. Number 1, again, we have this assessed or implicit fear of negative outcome. But number 2, we recognize, I will punish me even if the fucking world does not in the ways that I believe that it will. Then we probably remember some personal hell that we've put ourselves through in the past, which leads to step 3, taking no action in order to avoid the potential risk of living with ourselves. So step 4, we observe that there's safety from withdrawal and doing nothing new because we have been kept safe from our own negative self-assessments and punishments. And therefore, step 5, we continue to live in the same post-traumatic stress and self-defeated lifestyle as always because of our own threat against ourselves if we do not have self-compassion. And meanwhile, we've ironically been talking about these self-defense measures, right? Well, here's the thing. These self-defenses, as we discussed, are actually the brain protecting the brain from itself, from recognizing the results of its own actions, from some of the programs that it might be carrying that are not the best as far as engaging with the real world. Self defenses also are long term destructive when they're used unconsciously. They're not really good for us. They tend to just put blinders on us as we continue marching through the world in the same way as always. And self defenses are actually completely fucking unnecessary if we just have self compassion, right? You don't have to protect yourself from recognition of reality if you aren't going to beat the shit out of yourself for it. So the answer is simply to have self compassion. And this brought us to discussing asceticism and self deprivation as a self defense measure, which was not officially included in the paper that we were working off before. But it's a very interesting self defense that I found uponst the internet. Asceticism is unfulfilled and joyless living, quote, for your own protection. And it's another way that we try to get through life without damaging ourselves. If we don't have self compassion, we tend to cut off our own pleasure, our own joy, our own reasons for being alive, because that's a way to preemptively punish ourselves for any mistakes we might make or any mistakes we assume that we've made in the past. Asceticism, it's very CPTSD relevant. On the other hand, if we engage in self-compassionate recovery, which is the only real kind of recovery as far as yours truly is concerned, the individual, instead of doing all of that, continues to recognize their humanness, their pains, and their past in the present. And using that knowledge, they righteously behave kindly toward the self without fear. So, here are some self compassion tips to try to help you out. First of all, try for circumstantial compassion. That is what you have in common with you across all ages, right? Circumstances were not ideal for you to thrive as a child, in midlife, whatever that means to you, or probably now. So the compassionate point is that you can only navigate all of these circumstances as best you can and control how you treat yourself in response. The circumstances don't need to be exactly the same then versus now, but just noting that they are less than ideal, stressful, disorganizing, limiting. These things can spawn some self compassion that helps connect you to your autobiographical self and allows you to treat yourself with some kindness moving forwards. Another tip is to use what I call empathetic projection. It's a term I think I've made up. I don't really know. But this is when you allow yourself to identify with an outsider as a stand in for your own feelings. And then you take that projection, you turn it around, and place that emotion within the self. In other words, I have a hard time feeling for me, but I'm really good at feeling for other people. But it turns out I'm probably actually projecting my feelings onto them and assuming that it's their experience. So try to use it. You see someone, it sparks something inside of you. You feel the pain for them. Then you place the pain in yourself and ask, what's being shared here? Is it unideal circumstances, assumed difficult early lives, lack of opportunity and support, ongoing distress? What is the shared factor that is spawning this empathy? And can you offer self compassion once you recognize it? Additionally, you might want to humanize a bit. Remember that you are merely human. There are many limitations to being a member of this species. But first, we need to make sure your definition of human is accurate, because I think most of us have been given very lofty ideals about what humans should be able to do. The reality is that humans are messy and complicated, needy, socially oriented in a mandatory fashion. They are full of feelings that they don't really know how to handle. They're just doing their best. And humans require softness and care and kindness. Accept that these are truths about the human race. Accept that you are human too. But again, we have a lot of ideas about what humans are and what they should do. So you might want to more realistically acknowledge that you're a human, but you're also an animal. So dehumanize. If your brain is too human judgy, if you compare yourself to others in harsh light, whether that's positive or negative, instead you can think about being an animal rather than a human being. And this is powerful because humans should fill in about 1,000 things, but animals should, I don't know, like exist as best they can, using their little brains to the best of their abilities in the circumstances they find themselves in a crumbling world that domineering beasts are currently destroying, right? Yeah. Well, same for you. You're an animal. You're also existing as best you can, using your little brain to the best of your ability in the circumstances you find yourself in a crumbling world that domineering beasts are currently destroying, right? Doesn't that make you feel a little self-compassion for what you're going through day after day and always have been? If not, one more tip. Dehumanize and universalize. If that's still not enough recontextualization of your experience, remember that we're all just meat bodies navigating a really wet rock, hurtling through space, trying to understand what all of this requires of us, what it all means, and how to just keep breathing. Doesn't that make you feel one iota of compassion for your goddamn self? Well, I don't know. I can't tell you how to best feel for yourself. But again, what I can say for sure is that self accountability and forward motion, something that the podcast has primarily focused on for a few years, unfortunately, cannot outweigh your recognition of self experience or your action of self care. Self compassion is mandatory for trauma recovery, or you will stop moving forward because each step becomes a new opportunity for you to fuck up and then punish yourself endlessly for ever trying. So you'll eventually stop doing it. Without self compassion, you'll just continue to live in the shadow of your assumed self limitations and in repetition of your traumatic history, preventing yourself from ever taking the risks necessary to find meaningful, purposeful, or authentic living. And I think it's also worth mentioning that your early life probably included a real lack of compassion from the people around you. So continuing to live without self-compassion to this day is repeating the trauma that you've already experienced onto yourself, which we can definitely say is not recovery. One last time, self-accountability, education, rationalization, and forward motion in the name of responsibility. They're great, but they cannot outweigh your recognition of your self experience in the past and every single day, or your actions of self care. And that's why the lifelong war on CPTSD is made up of the daily battle, moment by moment, for what's probably most difficult for all of us: self-compassion. But without it, divided from your own recognition of self and self-care, you will fall. And that, fuckers, is what we're discussing over in the Patreon private stream as we continue with this series on self-compassion. Up next, we will be discussing how to actually engage with self-love, the obstacles between you and that thing, how to feel that thing, and how to start applying it in your own life with real practice. We're going to be moving into that next. Patreon.com/traumatized motherfuckers if you want the full rundown on that or any of the topics that we've just mentioned. And I do hope that you check out my video series. I think they'll help you remember some of this material as you start compassionately living with your own goddamn self. All right, fuckers. Hail yourself. Hail King Archie. Hail Marcus Barkus. And I'll talk to you real soon. Cheers, y'all. Bye-bye.